rise in Islamophobic sentiments and hate crimes in the post-Brexit period. I will also touch upon the issues of structural discrimination against the Muslim immigrants in different spheres of society. And lastly, I will talk about the negative portrayal of Islam and Muslims in the British mainstream media. So, when it comes to the various causes of UK's withdrawal from the EU, a few claim that sovereignty and a desire for the revival of Britain's institution regarded as one of the main concerns to opt out from the EU. But various surveys and opinion polls conducted around the Brexit campaign indicate that xenophobic and Islamophobic attitudes prevailed over the other factors, and the far right parties fueled the process. As per police records, religiously motivated crime increased by 160% from the year 2015 to 2020, and racist crime increased by 84% in the same period. These data on hate crimes against Muslim immigrants indicate that the highest occurrences of physical and verbal attacks happen mainly at public places, public transport, workplaces, businesses, and on private properties. In addition to this, Tell Mama UK, an independent hate crime monitoring group, also stated the same in its report. However, targets on religious places, mostly on mosques, cultural centers, Islamic centers, renders a complex image of violent physical offenses. In 2018, mosques in the UK were attacked for the purpose of vandalism in Preston. And in the same manner, another mosque in North England suffered nearly the similar damage. Recently, racist hatred in educational institutions conveys the message how young Muslim minds are affected by the growing Islamophobic sentiments in the institutional framework. Bethan reports in what manner young Muslim students were called terrorists at school, terrorists at school. And in some instances, girls have been told by the strangers to remove their headscarves. Current figures reveal that 6% of hate crimes in 2017 occurred in the educational institution. As a result, racist bullying and comments has increased the risk of mental health issues, mainly depression and paranoia. In an interview, a Muslim teenage schoolgirl talks about the remarks directed to her. She expresses stuff like "go back to your country," stuff about what's on my head without knowing necessarily what's it's for. These are the few examples of the inherent xenophobia and racism. For tackling these situations in schools, Muslim youth emphasized on early intervention through introducing multicultural studies in school that would help in creating awareness about the cultural diversity in the institutional framework. In case of workplace, a research based on social mobility depicted that 6% of the Muslim population in the UK endured into various professional jobs as compared to the 10% of the overall population in England and Wales. Numerous barriers towards better job opportunities, as cited by several academics, includes prejudice towards names sounding from a particular religious background. Second, anxieties of young Muslims becoming the target of harassment and bullying. And third, Muslim women who wear headscarves being more vulnerable to workplace discrimination. The professor who conducted the research pointed out in his own words that Muslims are being excluded, discriminated against, or fail at all stages of their transition from education to employment. Taken together, these contributory factors have profound implications for social mobility. Now at the end, the negative media coverage of Islamophobia during the Brexit campaign fanned the flame of anti-Muslim hatred. Rhetorical devices were employed by the mainstream media to link Muslims with terrorism, and a threat perception was created against them. According to a report, British tabloid, for instance, The Sun, demonized Muslims through alarmist headlines such as, for example, 1 in 5 Brit Muslims sympathy for jihadis. And press regulator IPSO investigated and reported that newspaper headlines are significantly misleading. This was not only restricted to tabloid newspapers, but also the Times, who as well asserted in their front page that Muslims were silent on terror. These outrageous, misleading headlines intensify further cultural divisions in the society. Here I conclude by pointing out that in the Brexit campaign, the cultural and racial change played on the fears of nationalists, who rallied behind the demand to unshackle Britain from the European Union, which was founded on the bedrock of European unity. Taking back control, the slogan used by the proponent of Brexit, also reveals the fault lines in British society, where the fear of Islam is being weaponized to normalize the increasing marginalization of Muslims in particular. Islamophobic sentiment is on the rise after Brexit, as data is the proof. Thank you.
Thank you, Akanksha, for that wonderful and precise analysis presentation on the issue of Islamophobia, and especially on the issue of Islamophobia and how this Islamophobic within Britain also coincided with that Brexit campaign, which I'm sure other presentation from Grazeldiz also would address that issue of take back control. What also is interesting is that you also touch on the point on issue of multiculturalism, then the issue of multiculturalism and the issue of the Muslim being excluded from education to employment. And you rightly pointed out, and it did not help either when we talk about the role of the media in these cases. And in the context of Britain, the media, especially the presence of the tabloid newspaper, further fanned the flame of such narratives about a particular section of the society or a particular community. And this, I say, despite the fact that in Britain, they have even the independent watchdog, right? The independent watchdog, which in most instances, such a watchdog also take action, but those action in the age of social media, in the age of real-time information, by the time this watchdog take action, much of the damage has been done. And we would see that, I think that this question will keep on coming, and I will not deal much with the Brexit, especially like you mentioned, that the rhetoric are not only in the post-Brexit, but we can see the rhetoric right from the ongoing campaign towards the referendum. And it did not stop even after Brexit. We could see that, and given from the data that you rightly pointed out, this continues to happen, or this Islamophobia, racism, not only against Muslims, but the other communities, also keeps on continuing. And but the question now we have to ask, how do we look at the larger picture of this narration, especially the larger picture? In fact, we look at the issue of migration elsewhere in Europe and in the neighborhood, and the policy of within European Union and European member states in bringing up this issue. You know that how do this issue that keeps on coming at the large issue, like events that happen in Syria, the migration that comes to Europe, and how media take this, and what kind of media take this issue. Of course, we have mentioned of tabloid, but I think we also have to take note in terms of social media, which most of these tabloid newspaper and news outlet has a massive presence. as more and more news go digital, then we also have to take that into account. So with that, I call upon the next presenter on Ravneet Kaur. And Ravneet,
so please unmute yourself. Yes. Am I audible now? Teiborlang, sir, please unmute yourself.
yeah, can you hear?
Yes,
Yes,
we can
sir.
hear you now.
Because it was like, so yes, Ravneet is a student of Center for European Studies, and she'll be presenting on Europe's Human Rights Challenge, securing the Roma. So this will be again another interesting presentation, which will focus again on another important yet a small community minority called the Roma, right? So over to you, Ravneet.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. As already mentioned, my topic is Europe's Human Rights Challenge, Securing the Romas. So my paper looks into the fact that how the human rights of the Roma community is being challenged in the European continent. As the Europeans have been the proponents of the human rights around the world, yet the people in their own land are facing the human rights challenge, and Roma, being the oldest community in Europe, is facing the challenge. So these people are treated as the other in the society. The Romas are treated as gypsies or migrants, while they have been part of the European social structure, but they're not part of the diaspora. As Charles Taylor in his book Politics of Recognition says, a person or a group of people can suffer real damage, real distortion if the people or society around them mirror back to them a confining or demeaning or contemptible picture of themselves. And this discrimination against the people lead to severe impact on their lives. As it said, that 90% of the Roma children are at the risk of poverty, and 41% of the Roma income is below the national respective at the risk of poverty threshold. So through this paper, I would like to try to highlight who the Roma people are, what are their struggles, and how is EU's human rights policy helping them, or is it just ambivalent and just present there and not actually actually working for them. So so the first question, who are the Romas? So Roma is a community found mostly in the Eastern and the Central Europe. However, over a period of time, they have migrated to many places in Europe. According to the historians, these people have migrated to Europe from South Asia in the middle of the 14th century. And according to the Amnesty International report, today they are the largest ethnic group and the most exploited one too. Romas have been routinely denied their human rights. In every indicator of the human rights, Roma fall under the lowest category. Romas have been exploited, as I've mentioned before, that they've been exploited since their arrival in the European land. The first law banishing Roma came in the Roman Empire in 1490. Then in 1530, England banned them under the Egyptian Act. This act was further amended in 1554, which became death penalties for them. And in 1603, the Privy Council asked the Gypsies to leave and never to return. So what we see is that the discrimination and the prejudices against the Roma communities have been since ages. For centuries, they have been marginalized, discriminated, and today they are the largest minority group in Europe, and still they face discrimination on the grounds of race, ethnicity, and identity. Their identity has always been under siege, even after residing in the country for centuries. There is a hesitance towards the acceptance of the Roma community. There's a hesitance towards the minorities, as because of the language and the culture, because language and culture becomes the greatest barrier in the terms of social practices and social inclusion. But one might ask that why are they still not accepted, and why are they still being treated as the outsiders while residing in the continent for so long? As I've already mentioned, that 90% of this Roma children are at the risk of poverty, and there are many cases and instances of exploitation, discrimination, hatred, scapegoating of them by the far right agencies. They are being denied right to equal access to healthcare. They've been left out of the emergency policy making. So this question of being of them being treated as the secondary citizen is still in question, while because they are the largest minority in the European continent. And it's just one incident. Even during the in the even after even after the implementation of the European Council's strategic framework on human rights in 2012, which defines the priorities and improvising the effectiveness of the EU policy by EU human rights policy by 2022, which tries to mainstream the human rights in the European Union internal and external policy, as human rights are not only important within the European Union but also for the citizens, and it is an intrinsic part of the EU's external action. They are still subjected to such kind of they're still subjected to subjected to be treated as the outsiders, discriminated, and being marginalized, or as we say, they are basically treated as the other in the community. So it's the Roma. The mobility is also particularly a central question concerning the European citizenship. The borders of the Europe, the migrant crisis in Europe, and the far right and the anti-immigrant racist populism across the Europe across Europe is basically treating them they're not being culturally accepted, and that in Europe, as mentioned, there is as I would like to tell, there's a sense of I'm sorry. So there is yes. The treatment is reflected reflected in the European identity. So as the scholars say that the Roma situation reflects a construct of European identity which views the Roma as outsiders who have no legitimate claim to the bundle of rights given to the true European citizens. This view is also substantiated by a seemingly endemic tendency towards essentializing and homogenizing Roma identities that have been debated during much of the last 20 years or more, and have been effectively inseparable from the ambivalent policies of labeling and that inevitably entangle the designation of the Roma as culturally distinct ethnic group with a pervasive socio-political identification of that group with the problem. There have been proposed measures. They have been contradictory because even after these measures, the situation in regards to Roma is questionable. There have been directives for Racial Equality Directive, which came in 2000, the Employment Equality Directive, which came in 2000, but still the people are not being provided with basic human rights such as education, housing facilities. They have the housing facilities or education or health facilities or jobs and so on and so forth. There have been instances like, for instance, in Slovakia, these people were thrown out of their houses in 2010 where they were residing, that these people are given places outside the cities to reside in and not integrated in the cultural and social milieu of the European diaspora. The major challenge the European community faces today is the implementation of the rules, as majorly the member states are not quite friendly in favor of having Romani people in the sovereign land, as mentioned, as in the Amnesty International report, the state of Roma in various European nations is questionable. They live in poverty. The women and the children suffer on grounds of low health and educational facilities provided to them. The social infrastructure Roma friendly. There have been serious violation of human rights. They face prejudices, discrimination on various grounds. So, however, the European human rights policy the European Union has stressed on the fact that they need for a stronger Europe, need to integrate Europe, and the integration of Europe is mainly dependent on the integration of the people. And in this case, Roma people union calls for Roma people, they call it a joint responsibility. In 2011, the European Commission adopted communication pushing for the development of the national Roma integration strategies. And by 2012, each EU member state had to produce a national Roma integration strategy. The European Roma Rights Center has been particularly active with the strategic litigation at both the national and international level, and claims to have set in motion of more than 500 court cases in 15 countries to bring justice to state and non-state actors who have discriminated against Romani individuals and have committed violence against them. The Human Rights Council, in its resolution on 14th July 2014, have identified Roma to have faced for more than five centuries, widespread and enduring discrimination, rejection, social exclusion, and marginalization all over the world and in all areas. Anti-Gypsyism has been defined by the Council of Europe as a specific form of racism and ideology founded on racial superiority, a form of dehumanization and institutional racism nurtured by historical discrimination, which is expressed, among others, by violence, hate speech, exploitation, stigmatization, and the most blatant kind of discrimination. However, and yet the situation has changed so much. In a report by the United Nations International Convent on Civil Political Rights, the European Union stand says that the European Union has recognized the participation of Roma individuals and communities cannot be reduced to occasional discussion, but must promote the empowerment and active involvement of Roma, including through supporting Roma NGOs to be effective. In 2011, the European Union came out with a planned report called Report on the Evaluation of the EU Framework for National Roma Integration Strategies up to 2020. The report assesses the relevant...
Can you wrap up?
Yes, sir. Just concluding.
Sure.
Effectiveness and efficiency, coherence, and EU added the value of the EU framework. So what we see is that there have been steps taken in terms of helping the Roma community, providing them with the basic rights and structure, and providing them with employment, capacity building, and decreasing against them. However, what lies underneath is the basic attitude of the people which needs to be changed. The anti-discrimination measures should be implemented strongly so that the Roma people are provided with what they need, and there should be more integration and assimilation in the society. So here I would like to end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravneet. Thank you for that, for giving us the overview of the status of the Roma people and how their rights are being violated, or how their rights are not, their human rights are not being honored. Mostly, especially when we talk about states, European states, or in the matter, even European member state, despite the fact of the existence of the EU level directives and framework with regard to not only human rights, particularly human rights, but general human rights, but particularly into the rights of the Roma people. What is also interesting is that you rightly mentioned, in fact, this idea about the Roma, the discrimination, whether physical or verbal or any form of violence that that the Roma people have endured, despite the fact of them being part and parcel of the European culture. And the interesting fact is this, is that when you ask about these discourses, is the first question is when you raise who are the Romas. That itself is a very important question to ask, because when one look at that question, because in most cases, and you mentioned in one word or two words that the word gypsy, right? That they've been considered as gypsy, which they have been considered a gypsy, which is they consider a gypsy, which is itself is a very offensive, offensive term, which the discourse, this discourse that comes out, that term them a gypsy as people who roam from one place to another place with no permanent place to stay, and associated with certain crime. So these are also these discourses. These are few of the terms and the discourses that perpetuate the discourse on the Roma people to the negative discourse, and that also to a large extent brought about the discrimination from the time they reached Europe, and more. And the gypsy also, we remember that apart from the Jew, the gypsy also are one of the most who has faced persecution, are one of the most persecuted people during the Nazi regime, the Nazi as a community. But what is, I can get a takeaway from your presentation is that what you have given us is that when we look at this discrimination against the Roma, it's not only today or yesterday, but this has been, this is historical facts, and that they have been discriminated, that their rights has been violated over a long period of European history, and in the discourse of European culture, European identity, particularly. So it is interesting, in fact, if one has to look at that, one has to also look at what is this, what we consider to be European identity, taken even from the fact that what Akanksha did today about Muslim. And what is the European identity? And the larger framework here is what you rightly pointed out, also is the European Citizenship Charter. So these all will come, I think, as we look, as we dig deep inside, as we try to probe more and more on the issue of European state, European identity. This will come to the forefront. Will come to the forefront on especially the issue of the minorities. So thank you so much for that. And now I call on to the next presenter. This is we have Shriya Singh. Shriya is a student of MA, so I'm glad that we have students from MA now regularly, that we keep on having students from MA doing our paper presentation and writing papers, which is very, very nice and encouraging to all of us. So we have Shriya. She's a MA student from the School of International Studies in PISM. And she'll be presenting on Re-orienting Victimhood, how the refugee crisis has reproduced the victim image of an Oriental woman. So I'm sure that this will be very interesting, and it's pretty new to me. So I look forward for your presentation, Shriya.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. A very good afternoon to all, and I express my thanks to the chair of the Center for European Studies as well as the conference secretariat for giving me this opportunity to be presenting on my topic called Reorienting Victimhood, how the refugee crisis has reproduced the victim image of the Oriental women. Before I dive right into the arguments of my presentation, I'd like to recall to your memory the story of Sharbat Gula, or what is her more common name, the Afghan woman of the Nat Geo fame. In 1985, when Steve McCurry photographed Sharbat Gula for the cover of the magazine, It immediately shot to international fame, symbolizing Afghanistan and the Soviet-Afghan War in the eyes of the West. And the caption for that image for 20 years after that was the haunted eyes tell of an Afghan refugee's fear. For 20 years, Sharbat Gula was known by the name of Afghan woman until her identity was discovered in 2002. The story of Sharbat Gula is important to my presentation today because what I'm trying to do here is to highlight and examine the broad trends of media representation of women refugees coming into Europe at the peak of the refugee crisis in 2015 and thereon from the Middle East. And I argue that there has been a continued Orientalist depiction of these women refugees, which has ended up in stereotyping and amounts to structural violence because of media misrepresentation. So why media? As the fourth estate of the society, media is not a power neutral entity. It is an institution of power which does not just present reflections of pre-existing social realities. In fact, it constructs and imposes meanings on its subjects. So what Foucault would call the production of knowledge by power. So in its production, representation, and consumption within the European society, the traditional media, that is the television and the print culture in Europe, has imposed meanings, and it is also, and why it is important is because it's the primary source of information on the refugees for the European audience and its readers, giving it a certain sort of a monopoly on the discourses around the refugees. But much on that later. What I want to talk about is who is the Oriental woman. So Edward Said talks about how Orientalism is the discursive and textual production of the Orient in the eyes and imagination of the Occident through mediums of arts, photograph, and the text. It uses binary oppositions like savage versus the civilization, irrational versus the rational, self versus the other, to not only legitimize colonial rule within the Near Orient and what is today called as the Middle East, but also to exert a sort of a cultural hegemony. Similarly, the Oriental woman then becomes this vulnerable, passive figure who is oppressed by not only local patriarchy and the barbaric Oriental man, these are both constructions, but also by the primitiveness of the Oriental society. So the whole rationale of the savior, becoming the savior of the Oriental, vulnerable Oriental woman, becomes the colonial logic of imposing the empire's rule. And this is something, and this rationale does not only end with colonialism, it is something that we see continuing into very much the 21st century, when major events happen in Iraq, whether it's the invasion of Iraq by US or by the recent 2011 Arab Spring and the turmoil that follows thereafter. We see that media representation within the West, and now that we're talking about Europe here, so they have been Orientalist in their portrayal of the victim, constantly victimizing and putting the victimization frames on the Oriental woman. So, and these media representations become extremely important in the times of crisis because, like I said, monopoly of discourse. Also, how these issues are sensationalized for political gains in the backdrop of populism, something that we've already discussed in previous panels. But in a 2020 study which analyzes 500 journalistic photographs from the top 10 news media houses of the 5 kind of Western European countries that were most impacted by the refugee crisis, has concluded that not only the refugees coming from the Middle East are portrayed more negatively, alongside issues of violence and terrorism, but also the women refugees from this group, they are constantly portrayed within the frames of victimization, as opposed to the male refugees from this group, who are portrayed within a frame of as an economic threat or a security threat or an economic burden. So even in a condition of statelessness, the women refugees end up as this agency-less, powerless victims who do not have the agency of being a threat of any kind. This not only reinforces ideas about traditional and socially accepted gender roles this sort of a division of frames that we are seeing within media representation of victimization and threat between male and female refugees is not only reinforces the ideas about typical gender roles in lesser developed societies, but something can be said about here also the Muslimness of these representations. So first of all, not only all the women refugees coming from Middle East are immediately assumed to be Arab Muslims, which is a very homogeneous monolithic identity in itself, which might be constituted of many minorities from the region and contain many plural identities. But this study also concludes that there is an increasing portrayal of religious symbols alongside women refugee portrayals. And the use of these religious symbols like the veil, which gets translated immediately into an alongside a religious identity, also a racial and ethnic identity. Such what have been called misrepresentation or dehumanizing narratives, what they end up doing is a denial of subjectivity to the women refugees, wherein their multiple realities and their voices are not only silenced, but also a meaning is imposed on the image that is being represented. This is done in myriad ways. Like in media narratives, the nationality of the women refugees is emphasized upon as Syrian or Iraqi as over their name or their age, emphasizing a nationality over personhood, which eventually ends up mobilizing a sentiment of otherness and also a dissimilarity from the collective European identity. Moreover, there is a certain exoticization and an over-sexualization of the image when there are graphic exaggerations of tales of sexual violence and genital mutilation, which is done to evoke sympathy, but may end up over-sexualizing these figures of the women refugees from this area. What we see here is that women's bodies, they then become cultural markers between the East and the West, whether they are being shown alongside a veil for representing otherness or for what I call a motherness, because many images of women refugees, they are portrayed alongside their child as reinforcing the idea of the mother figure and emphasizing their role as mothers as opposed to independent women. So what is this reorientation of victimhood? It is a sort of a reproduction of this Oriental victim image of the women from the Middle East, as I have mentioned earlier, but then it is a literal reorientation of the European imagination to the fear of the other, which we see in the debates around securitization, which have been extensively discussed already in previous panels. And acknowledgement of victimhood, my last point is that acknowledgement of victimhood is not wrong. It is not that these women are not victims. In fact, it is very much required to acknowledge their victimhood, so to provide them relief as well as their due rights. But when representations of victimhood, they become a form of a structural violence themselves, it can amount to being a violence multiplier that may manifest itself into many other forms of violence within the host societies, and then that becomes the roadblock to meaningful social and economic integration of these women refugees within the host societies of Europe. So with that, I end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Shriya, for the wonderful presentation, and thank you for that. Particularly, you have touched upon the issues that concern women as the victim of this representation or presentation, or the representation, especially in the media, and not only on the media but on the general public as well. More importantly, is that what I get from your presentation is that this presentation, or what you call your presentation on the reproduction of the image of women as a victim has a long way to, as a counterproductive, at times it's a counterproductive to women itself. And it's more important, especially because when we look at the data of refugees that anywhere in the world, we'll always hear, or we'll always see, and we'll always see the fact, these data that women and children are one of the most affected, in the crisis, from the crisis up to the stage where they become a refugee or seek refuge. So in that way, it's important, and it's important also to highlight the issues that affect women, and especially how the discourses, how the narratives on them particularly are important, especially when we take into the context of how women also, apart from highlighting them as victims, like you rightly pointed out, but sometimes that the representation or the knowledge of the victim get lost because there are other things that comes in on the way, the other representation of the way that you pointed out. One is the exotization, which does not, and sexualization, which did not end with colonialism, with that white man's burden, civilizing mission, but which did not end there, but it still continues till today. So that is very important. That is that you highlighted that, and the other part is that how that the woman image, the image of the woman now also form part and parcel of that secretization of migration, especially when you see a Muslim woman with a veil traveling from one place to another place, trying to seek refuge from conflict. And that veiled woman is not looking more, apart from looking at her a victim, but behind that victimhood was shared again, and what represented in the media and the other circle, especially to the other right-wing political party, and these populist parties, they will look at that veil rather as more than a victim, but rather as a threat. Then that the whole issue again now comes alongside the secretization of migration, so becomes part of that narration, and that's what we see in any posters, these posters of the far right posters or the anti-immigrant posters, so on and so forth. Those posters will not have that much of a resonant effect to them without an image of a woman with a veil or with a burqa. So that itself is it produces a lot of meaning, a lot of meaning that are sometimes carry this misinformation, or that carries also to perpetuate violence against women, against refugees, and against even to the community itself, like what Akanksha was mentioned earlier. So thank you for that presentation. And then now I call upon Grazel Lyngdoh. She's a research scholar in the Center for European Studies, and she'll present her presentation is a very interesting presentation. Now this topic, this is on social media. So she looks at social media and the campaign towards the Brexit referendum. So her title is "The Role of Social Media in Amplifying Anti-Immigration Sentiment as an Election Strategy, a study of the 2016 Brexit referendum." So over to you, Grazel.
Thank you, sir. 1 second. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see.
Thank you so much for giving this opportunity to me to present my paper. It's entitled "The Role of Social Media in Amplifying Anti-Immigration Sentiments as an Addicting Strategy, a study on the 2016 Brexit referendum."
Maybe you can try that, Grazel, because we don't have much time either, I think, so, because the next session will start at 3:05. So in fact, we are behind schedule.
I'll just 1 second.
Yeah, so quick, maybe in 5, 6, 7 minutes if you can.
Okay. Okay, so my paper today seeks to identify the role of the internet in dissemination of anti-immigration biases during the Brexit referendum campaign, as Europe has witnessed an unprecedented surge in the adoption of social media in promoting campaign ideologies and amplifying polarizing information. So the EU referendum, also known as Brexit, was held on the 26th of June 2016, marking a defining point in British politics and its relations with the EU referendum, European Union. Of the hallmarks of this campaign was the use of social media by political parties and leaders. Social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook were employed to disperse information, supplementing, and even at times bypassing traditional media. As social media's reach and speed has been no match for conventional media like newspapers, and as such, news agencies have taken advantage of these platforms to push their content by employing polarizing and clickbait titles. So social media networking sites produce news content based on consumers' likes, follows, and location, and employ this data to present targeted information to advertisers, including political parties. Political parties have continuously accommodated the latest communication to garner support, and these technologies have wide-ranging implications that have restructured the way political leaders communicate. And a majority of British political parties have an online presence, which has allowed voters, political parties, and its users to directly communicate with each other in real time. The Brexit conversation on social media. The Brexit referendum could be labeled as the first digital referendum, as there was a shift where traditional political advertising was relegated in favor of a targeted and digital approach. So the internet was utilized for voter registration, for fundraising, intelligence gathering, and message dissemination. Drawing on demographic data such as age, location, religion, gender, combined with indicators of the user's interests, parties were able to identify those interests and use them to filter messages directly to the electorate. In a post-truth world, it has become very difficult to ascertain fact from fiction, and social media was very significant in this with its unchecked flow of unverified information and its filter bubbles and echo chambers, which mean that we are increasingly unlikely to be exposed to facts and opinions that challenge our own views. And throughout this campaign, both sides played fast and loose with the truth. There were many issues covered. So within my MPhil thesis, I looked at the hashtag Brexit on Twitter, and as part of my thesis, I've collected 30,92,895 tweets under the Brexit hashtag. And for this paper today, I've undergone a text analysis of the tweets that I've collected. And there were a total of 48,347 tweets, which had the keywords migration and immigration. And a text analysis of these tweets found that 63% of these tweets were negative in connotation as opposed to positive connotation. So there were multiple issues covered within the EU referendum debate. And according to a study by Moore and Ramsey, where they studied the issues taken under the British media, they found that immigration was the second most mentioned topic, with over 40,000 articles in the British press through the 10-week campaign, which preceded economy, which was mentioned about 7,000 times here. And although the economy was the most referenced political issue, 4 out of 10 in these issues on economy also referred to immigration. And in the 2 years leading to the referendum, according to an Tiwari issues index, immigration had consistently been one of the top issues facing Britain. Coverage of immigration and migrants during the EU campaign was notable in several ways. The prominence, the volume, and the persistence with which immigration and its effects were covered, the degree which the Leave campaign leaders raised the issue of immigration and the impacts of migration on the UK, the extent to which the news outlets reported these comments, and the extent to which these same news outlets went further than the claims of the campaign leaders in their coverage of immigration, the range of issues for which migrants were blamed, and the hostility aimed at migrants from both campaign leaders as well as the coverage of immigration, and the degree to which certain nationalities of these migrants were subjected to negative coverage in relation to immigration. The Remain leaders rarely raised the issue of immigration, unless unprompted, instead focused on the negative economic effects of Brexit and on responding to warnings about economic implications. And rather than arguing for the positive benefits of immigration, they emphasized on the steps they were taking to control immigration. And eventually Remain leaders found themselves criticizing the claims of the Leave campaigns rather than actually making a positive case for the current immigration policy or its impact on the economy and public services. So there were multiple headlines in the British press, and these are a few that I have taken today. Many immigration articles were sourced directly from the Leave campaign itself. These were literal quotes from the Leave campaign, and these headlines were widely then disseminated on social media platforms like Twitter, where they became worldwide hashtag trends. These are some of the ads that were amplified on social media, where they highlighted immigration the most. And these were sponsored posts where people would see them, and these posts were sponsored based on the person's likes on social media and their old feed and all of that. So the UKIP poster was the breaking point, was emblazoned on a fleet of vans in the final days of the Leave campaign. This poster was actually not just a xenophobic campaign, but a cumulative force of an aggressive anti-immigration sentiment that was long legitimated by the political mainstream and also reproduced in the news media. Anti-immigration sentiments have existed in Britain long before the referendum, and a 2014 Ipsos Mori poll found that nearly 50% of respondents felt that immigration was one of the most pressing issues in the UK, dwarfing other issues like economy, unemployment, and crime. So the Leave campaign message simply tapped into this pre-existing bias social undercurrent. And in addition to reporting on public concern about the level of immigration, ineffectiveness of immigration policy, and specific consequences of migration, the Leave campaign leaders and also the news outlets explicitly blamed migrants for many of the UK's political, social, economic ills.
Grazel, can you wrap up?
Yes, sir, I'm just wrapping up. So funding. Both campaigns spend millions of pounds of Facebook on online advertising, and the official campaigns obtain grants of over £600,000 to fund the activities. They also receive substantial donations from corporations and individuals. They utilize big data mining to draw canvassing returns, social media traffic, voter records, and consumer databases. And the Leave and Remain campaigns both use this information to gather intelligence and construct detailed and personalized voter profiles. And using social media analytics, they were able to assign each voter scores based on how likely they were to vote and which side were they going to vote. The Leave campaign also developed a smartphone app, and they used other various examples of it. Then the Vote Leave campaign was fined £61,000, and they were referred to the police by the Electoral Commission for breaking electoral laws after they exceeded the legal spending limit of over 7 million. The limit was 7 million, and they released it over 500,000. So in conclusion, the rise of digital campaigning has raised important issues for regulators, organizations, and the government. And the UK Information Commissioner has begun investigations into the use of personal data and analytics by political campaigns, parties, social media companies, and other organizations in 2017. And within the UK Parliament, the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee continues its inquiry into the impact of fake news on modern democracy. As a consequence of the dissemination of these sentiments online, there was an increase in the overall support of the anti-immigrant message of the Leave campaign. And evidence suggests that voters can be receptive to negative messaging concerning immigrants and other ethnic minorities. The relentless coverage of the refugee crisis in the online media brought the topic of immigration to an unprecedented national stage globally. Yes, sorry, I'm just ending. So while immigration has been a long, important mobilizing force for political conservatives, this referendum was different because as voters were going to cast their vote, an influx of asylum seekers into Europe was reaching its peak. And the confluence of these two events opened a unique opportunity for the political right to reshape the language of immigration. And by blurring the boundaries between the EU and non-EU, the economic and humanitarian, and the legal and illegal migration, the Leave campaign challenged established notions of membership, nationality, and human rights in a democratic vote, and they won. Thank you.
Thank you, Grazel, for that wonderful presentation. And this presentation, in fact, reinforced the theme of this session on discourse and media narration. And then it very well fit on with all that, how these media, especially when you talk about the traditional media or the new media, the new digital media, especially the social media, how they have reinforces that the narratives produce what do you call these the narratives and discourses, and represents the voices of many of these citizens or public. In fact, whether that is you could see that in certain cases, like Grazel pointed out, negative hashtag, negative far more resonate with the general public audience, and more about those kind of audience where it's much more, if you look in context where a situation where the country faces economic crisis, economy slowdown, unemployment, so on and so forth. So it's a very interesting presentation, especially given that the data that you have presented. I won't take much time, but then we don't have much time either for a question and answer, but maybe if anyone have, maybe you can take one or two question from the public. If you have Professor Sarkar.
Yeah, you can just take just two brief questions.
Two brief questions, and the presenter can answer maybe in a minute, in a word or two. So if there is any question, we can have those.
So I would like to answer the questions asked.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to answer the second question first. What are the measures can be taken to reduce Islamophobia by the government of UK in the post-Brexit era? Yes, measures are needed, and at the policy level, as Islamophobia is not yet recognized in the UK. Although there are recommendations and discussions on Islamophobia, but there is no, but they don't consider it as a problem in the society. So this is the answer of the second question. Regarding the first question, is there any political gain for parties in the right? Yes, there are political gains, such as these political parties take advantages to capitalize on the hatred of, anti-immigrant hatred, to deviate from issues of development and other areas in the country. So these.
Okay, thank you, Akanksha. Is there any other one more question we can take last?
So my paper does not cover it.
Thank you, Akanksha. Is there any other question? Else we will stop here and then we'll call it a day for the session. So, let me thank Professor Sarkar for giving us a chance to share the session, and thanks to all the presenters for this wonderful presentation. And I hope this presentation will improve further, and then you'll take maybe if you can ask if anyone has a question, you can directly put in the chat box, which can be passed them to the presenter, which they can improve the paper further on. And with that, I once again thank you all, and then we'll look forward to the next session. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for ably conducting the session and all the presenters for their insightful presentations. Given the paucity of time, we'll be straight away moving on to working session 8 for the conference. I now hand it over to Nikhil, who will be coordinating working